Hello students, this is Tulika Banerjee from Forensic Science Unit, SGTB Khalsa College, University of Delhi, presenting this module on behalf of Dr. P. Swathi, Assistant Professor and Head, Department of Psychology, Osmania University, Hyderabad. I am delighted to present this lecture on polygraphy. Before we start our chapter with the introduction of this chapter, let's look at the other modules we will study in this chapter. Module 1 Introduction, Module 2 Meaning and Definition of Polygraphy Test, Module 3 is regarding brief history of the polygraphy test, Module 4 is regarding procedure for conducting polygraph test, Module 5 is regarding types of test in polygraphy, Module 6 is regarding applications of polygraphy, and the last module, which is module number 7, is about the conclusion. When we lie, our blood pressure goes up, our heart beats faster, we breathe more quickly, and our breathing slows once the lie has been told, and changes takes place in our skin moisture. A polygraph charts these reactions with pens on a moving strip of paper. The result is jagged lines that don't convey a lot to you. But an examiner can tell from those mechanical scribbles whether or not you have spoken the truth, as said by polygrapher Chris Gugas. The society owes a commitment to the people that the potential and strength of their states is not abused in the dispensation of justice, and that the concept of human right is upheld and nurtured all the time. To preserve the common rights, the basic tool human being has devised is the police setup. Death, rape and torture in police custody are common. Factual reports have embarrassed several state government and their police personnel who employed third-degree methods in the interrogation of the suspected people detained to disclose the truth or their plans. The third-degree method will never put an end to the crime, as a criminal get hardened and wish to take revenge and cause embarrassment to the establishment. Interrogation of the suspected criminals using third-degree methods often results into loss of fear and respect for the authority of the state. The law enforcement agency in the country will have to react effectively by scientific interrogation of the victim and the accused and try to get as much evidence as possible to establish the charge. This is to be done by resorting to forensic polygraphy technique. Forensic polygraphy is the technique to check deception of truth by a subject juxtaposed with the veracity of his statement, as stated by B.B. Nanda and R.K. Tiwari in the year 2001. At present, the criminal are taking into consideration new techniques in the commission of crime. So, there is a dire need that the prosecution agency rely on something more authentic, more actual and more creative in terms of convictions without the police having to resort to the third-degree traditional method that not only violates fundamental human rights, but also fail to produce the positive results most of the time. Recent times have witnessed an epidemic in the use of contemporary scientific techniques such as the lie detector, brain mapping and narco-analysis. The polygraph testing or instrumental measures several psychological methods, example the heart rate changes in these process. From the chart of those measures in the response to the question on a polygraph test and sometimes aided by observations during the polygraph test, examiners infer a psychological state, namely whether a person is telling the truth or is he lying. Nevertheless, in India, this technique is not so trustworthy. The scientific basis on which the polygraph works is that the consciously held feelings of guilt produce a defensive reaction in the form of psychological changes in the blood pressure, pulse rate, respiration rate, and in the electrical resistance of the skin known as GSR, that is galvanic skin reaction. Usually the fear of detection and entrapment induces a person to lie. The term polygraph refers to a process in which selected physiological activities are recorded. According to the definition of Webster's Legal Dictionary, a polygraph is a device for measuring certain involuntary bodily responses such as blood pressure and perspiration, from which an opinion is drawn as to whether or not the person being tested is telling the truth. It is also called to some extent positively a lie detector. The problem with it is that it may yield accurate opinions in many cases. It may make nervous or confused truth tellers, and there is no way to know exactly which results are accurate and which are not. In the US federal agencies, a polygraph test is also referred to as a psychological detection of deception or PDD examination. The theory underlying a lie detector test is that lying is distressing and that this distress can be calculated and they can record on polygraph machine. The polygraph is a pneumatically operated device which concurrently records changes in the subject's blood pressure, pulse rate, respiration rate and depth, psychogalvanic skin reflex, that is skin resistance to electrical current, and in some cases the muscular activity. When a subject is put to the polygraph test or the lie detector test, the machine reflects and records only the subject's physiological responses to the questions asked by the operator, who then interprets the polygraph and determines whether the subject is lying or otherwise. The instrument in fact records the sign of internal stress accompanying the deception. Modern polygraph recording has become computerized. This consists of a computer, a combination unit that provides for magnification of the physiological signals and their conversion to the digital form and a printer. Lie detectors are called polygraph because the test consists of, at the same time, monitoring several suspects' psychological functions, that is breathing, pulse and galvanic skin response, and printing out the result on a graph paper. The printout shows exactly when during the questioning period the biologic responses occurred. If the period of maximum biologic reaction lines up with the solution question on the graph paper, the question that would associate the person as being involved with the crime, stress is assumed. Along with this assumption of stress comes the second assumption that the stress indicates a lie. The polygraph mechanism is used and in gathering psychological data by measuring three methods or the psychological indicators of excitement. The system or indicator is the rate and depth of respiration at the same time as measured by pneumograph that are in serious situation in the region of the trunk and the stomach. Secondly, cardiovascular activity is measured by a blood pressure cuff. Thirdly, the test of perspiration is being detected by way of electrodes that are attached to the fingertips, as stated by R. Sridhar in the year 2011. The origin of polygraph test has been traced back to the efforts of Lombroso, a criminologist who experimented with a machine that measured blood pressure and pulse rate to assure the honesty of the person suspected of criminal conduct. Polygraphy, that is a science of truth verification based upon psychophysiological analogues, is barely 100 years old. In 1730, British novelist Daniel Defoe wrote an essay entitled An Effectual Scheme for the Immediate Preventing of Street Robberies and Suppressing All Other Disorders of the Night, wherein he recommended that taking the pulse of a suspicious fellow was a practical, effective and humane method for distinguishing truthfulness from lying. Defoe's was an early and incisive suggestion to employ medical science in the fight against crime. In 1878, science first came to the aid of truth seeker through the research of Italian physiologist Angelo Mosso. It was then that Mosso used an instrument called a plethysmograph in his research on emotion and fear in subjects undergoing questioning, and he studied the effects of these variables on their cardiovascular and respiratory activity. Mosso studied blood circulation and breathing patterns and how they changed under certain stimuli. The use of the plethysmograph revealed periodic undulations or waves in a subject's blood pressure caused by the respiratory cycle in response to certain stimuli. Angelo Mosso was the first scientist to report on experiments in which he observed that a person's breathing pattern changed under certain stimuli and that this change in turn caused variations in their blood pressure and pulse rate. Until the end of the 19th century, no measuring device for the detection of deception had ever been used. The first use of scientific instrument designed to measure the physiological responses for the purpose came in 1895 when Italian physician, psychiatrist and pioneer criminologist Cesare Lombroso modified an existing instrument called a hydroshigmograph and used this modified device in his experiments to measure the physiological changes that occurred in a crime suspect's blood pressure and pulse rate during a police interrogation. Notably, Lombroso's early device for measuring pulse rate and blood pressure is similar to the cardiosphygmograph component of the contemporary polygraph. Although Cesare Lombroso did not invent the hydroshigmograph, he is accorded with the distinction of being the first person to have used the instrument successfully as a means for determining truthfulness from deception in crime suspects. On several occasions, he used the hydroshigmograph in actual cases to assist the police in the identification of criminals. In 1925, Leonardo Keeler, who had gained first-hand experience in polygraph interrogations as a result of working with John A. Larson at the Berkeley Police Department, worked to devise a polygraph that used inked pens for recording the relative changes in a subject's blood pressure, pulse rate and respiratory patterns, thus eliminating the need for smoking the paper and then preserving it with shellac. In 1926, the Keeler polygraph came on the market as the new and improved lie detector, an enhanced version of John A. Larson's polygraph. In 1938, Leonardo Keeler further refined the polygraph when he added a third physiological measuring component for the detection of deception, the psychogalvanometer, a component that measured changes in a subject's galvanic skin resistance during questioning, and in doing so, thus signaling the birth of the polygraph as we know it today. In 1939, Leonardo Keeler patented what is now understood as the prototype of the modern polygraph, that is the Keeler polygraph. Today, Leonardo Keeler is known as the father of polygraph. Since 1962, The study of the use of computers in physiological detection of deception has progressed through several phases. In the late 1970s, Dr. Joseph F. Cubis of Fordham University in New York City was the first researcher to use the potential computer applications for the purpose of polygraph chart analysis. Originally, it is significant to note that there is no one polygraph technique. There are a great many polygraph techniques known by many names, even though they all have certain qualities in general. All polygraph tests involve the measurement of physiological responses, usually respiration, palmar sweating, and cardiovascular activity, with an instrument while the subject is asked a series of questions. Polygraph test begins with an interview during which the examiner psychologically prepares the subject for the test. Once collected, the physiological data are usually evaluated by the examiner. Failed law enforcement examinations are often followed by an intense interrogation designed to force the subject to confess to the crime in question. However, substantial differences exist between the various polygraph tests in the character of the pre-test interview, in the structure of the question series, and in the assessment of the physiological data, as stated by Charles R. Honts and Mary V. Perry in the year 1992. In polygraph test, the variation in the pulse rate, heart skin, skin conductance and blood pressure are measured. Before conducting the polygraph test, there are some steps which are to be followed by the examiner. That is, go through the background of the case, formatting the questionnaire based on the background of the case, appraise the subject on the objective of the test, the nature of the instrument, its various attachment and recording. During the test, the heartbeat increases, blood pressure goes up, breathing and so on and so forth. In the very beginning, a baseline for the psychological characteristic is established by asking those answers the investigator already known. Deviation from this predetermined baseline for truthfulness measured by the lie detector is taken as a sign of life. This test does not involve any direct invasion of the body. This basically produces a graph of multiple psychological parameters and hence the name polygraph. In this test, the polygraph taken gives a reading of the deviation of the psychological parameter from the baseline for truthfulness, which is then determined by the natural question asked in the very beginning. The graph that is produced after the interrogation with the target question is aimed to make a possible liar uneasy in his psychological reaction, which is examined by an expert who would then explain their reaction in the court and also to the law enforcement officer to aid them in their investigation. His conclusion, which would flow from his reading of the polygraph, may be admitted or rejected by a judge on appreciation of the statements and the objection raised thereto by the defense and other expert. In case of a polygraph, the subject may or may not answer the question. His psychological reaction and response of his answer to the analysis of that is sought to be tendered as evidence if and when the occasion arises. In polygraph process, three aspects of human physiology are tested, that is the pneumograph test. I repeat, that is the pneumograph tracing. The second one, electrodermal activity tracing, and the cardiovascular tracing. The first relate to respiration, the second to skin conductor or skin resistance, and the third with blood volume and pulse rate. When an individual undertakes a polygraphic lie detection test, the first phase of this usually involves an interview with the polygrapher during which some biographical questions will be asked during the lie detection test. It will be asked by the polygrapher to the individual whether the individual understands every question or not. Many polygraphers also use this first phase to obtain an initial impression of the testee and to judge whether the individual seems to be more of an honest, upright citizen than a deceiver. At this time, the polygraph will not have been switched on, but now the polygrapher will explain its basic principle. He or she will connect the individual to the machine and show the testee how it works. The second phase begins when the suspect is asked a series of questions to which the reply of either no or yes must be given. The polygraph is switched on and is now out of sight of the testee, usually behind him or her. During this phase, the various psychological activity which may accompany the testee's answer to the question is displayed and recorded on pen chart by the polygraph. The basic principle underlying the modern polygraph is that of making a comparison between how a person responds to the non-incriminating question and how he or she responds to the incriminating question. In relevant questioning techniques, several irrelevant questions are framed which have no basis on the case or involvement of the subject in a crime under investigation. The relevant questions are interposed in between irrelevant questions which have a direct bearing on the case and are likely to draw a stressed response from a quality subject. The typical relevant-irrelevant test employs a series of 10 to 15 questions comprised of crime-relevant questions. The first type, control question test or the CQT test. Nowadays, the control question, that is CQ technique, is most commonly used for polygraph test. Control question tests are the second group of detection of deception test. This test consists of control question and the relevant question. Control question are interposed among the relevant and the irrelevant question. The control questions are irrelevant to the facts being investigated, but they are intended to provoke distinct psychological responses as well as false denials, such as stated by Subodh K. Singh in the year 2012. They do not directly relate to the crime under investigation, but to a similar situation in which his answer may have a feeling of concern with respect to either its truthfulness or its accuracy. These responses are compared with the responses triggered by the relevant question. The second type, a direct lie test or the DLT or stim test. When a subject is calling or telling the truth, this test tries to detect lying by telling the subject to deliberately lie. The psychological responses are being compared. The guilty knowledge test or the GKT. This test compares the psychological responses to multi-choice type questions relating to crime under investigation, one choice of which contains information relating only to the crime investigation and sometimes not, and the real culprit would know about. The next type, that is the peak of tension test or POT. Peak of tension question is framed when some of the important details of the offence in question are not made known to the subject. The test questions are framed in such a way that only one question will have bearing upon the matter under investigation and all others come close to the guilty knowledge. The series of questions framed are administered with the instrument attached. During the first reading, if the subject has no knowledge or information on the pertinent question put to him, then there would be no tension. The truthfulness or falsity of the subject is assessed by relying on the record of the psychological response. It has been seen that on many occasions that the suspect defendants in criminal cases have sought reliance to this technique to demonstrate their innocence. It can be said that the theory behind the application of this technique is based on the fact that a guilty person may possess such knowledge which cannot be possessed by any other person who is innocent. The pertinent question would bring in emotional reactions in a guilty person alone in comparison to an innocent person. Polygraphy is used in several settings, some more contentious than others. Many of the controversies regarding polygraph testing are the result of a failure to differentiate these contexts. Employment screening. One area that has attracted particular criticism is employment screening. Starting in the 1930s, private businesses began to use polygraphy to monitor the honesty of their employees. In the 1960s, pre-employment screening of job applicants was introduced. Questions were asked about theft from previous employers, drug use and the like, but then increasingly inquiries were also made about lifestyle factors such as sexual orientation and marital fidelity. Use of polygraphy in forensic psychiatry. The other arena where there is much confusion regarding the role of polygraph testing is in its use by the police and in the criminal justice system generally. In 1921, James Fry was charged with murder, having confessed to the crime after his arrest on an unconnected robbery charge. He subsequently withdrew his confession, claiming it was made because of police inducements. He passed a lie test administered by William Marston, but the trial judge did not allow Marston to give evidence. Fry was convicted, but appealed on the grounds that Marston's testimony should not have been excluded. The appeals court upheld the initial decision. In what has become known as the Fry standard, the court stated that Marston's lie detector test had not gained sufficient acceptance within the scientific community to be considered as scientific evidence. Ironically, Fry was later exonerated and set free. The Fry standard became the test for the admissibility of scientific evidence in the US courts, meaning that polygraph evidence was largely inadmissible in American courtrooms for the next 70 years. In 1993, Supreme Court decision in Daubert versus Meraldo Pharmaceuticals Inc., however, broadened the test for admissibility of expert evidence. It gave judges the freedom to make decisions about whether to admit the evidence of experts, including polygraph examiners, on a case-by-case basis depending on its relevance, reliability and the extent to which it meets scientific standards. Regardless of its standing in court, however, many police forces use polygraphy in their investigation of crime. Sometimes the aim is to eliminate individuals from suspicion, sometimes it is to encourage a confession, and sometimes it is to provide new lines of inquiry. Next is post-conviction testing. There have been occasional examples dating back to the 1960s of judges using polygraph testing to assist in the management of offenders on probation, but its application in post-conviction settings became widespread in the late 1990s in relation to the monitoring and treatment of sex offenders. Evaluation of post-conviction sex offender testing, that is PCSOT programs, consistently describe fuller and more accurate information about offenders' histories and increased disclosure regarding previous victims, types of offences, age of onset of sexually deviant behavior, continued masturbation to deviant fantasies and engagement in so-called high-risk behavior. There is also evidence to show that it can act as a deterrent to re-offending. To preserve the common rights, the basic tool human being has devised is the police setup for the administration of law and order. Interrogation of the suspected criminals using third-degree methods often results into loss of fear and respect for the authority of the state. Recent times have witnessed an epidemic in the use of contemporary scientific techniques such as the lie detector, brain mapping and narcoanalysis. The polygraph testing or instrumental measures several psychological methods such as heart rate changes in these process. From the chart of those measures in the response to the question on a polygraph test and sometimes aided by observations during the polygraph test, examiners infer a psychological state, namely whether a person is telling the truth or is he lying. Dear students, this brings to the end of this module and today's lecture. I hope you have learned and gained valuable knowledge about polygraphy. I hope you all have understood the underlying concepts of this chapter. Do keep in mind what we discussed today. I'll be back with one more lecture in the series. If you want to learn more and enhance your knowledge, you may log on to our website www.cec.nic.in for MCQ, quizzes, LORs, etc. Make sure you revise the modules frequently so that you master the topic well and take up the exercises. Thank you for your time today. I'll see you in the next lecture. Keep learning, work hard and do revise the chapter. Goodbye.